The buff sequence, one of the best features that we have gotten pretty much ever. In many ways, the buff sequence met a lot of my expectations. In some others, it actually disappointed me. Some classes don't benefit from it as much as I thought they would, and in those cases, I was really counting on the buff sequence to actually fix some core issues I have with a couple classes that I play. Yet some other classes that I play benefit from it just as much as I thought it would, and actually go a little above and beyond in some ways that I wasn't expecting. While the general premise of this feature is rather simple, and most of you have probably set up some kind of button for yourselves, there may be some ways to use it that you haven't yet considered. Let's start off with an example from my main class, Dawn Warrior. While you can get most of the burst abilities that a Dawn Warrior has on your buff sequence, there are some that weren't able to fit on. For example, Eclipse. Any ability that has some kind of reason to repress the ability to activate some kind of special feature, whether it be Dawn Warrior's Eclipse or Buccaneer's little lightning balls, it will not work with the burst sequence or buff sequence, even if it does let you add it to the bar. However, while that aspect was a little bit disappointing, Dawn Warrior actually got something I really was not expecting, and that's the ability to add True Sight to a buff sequence. For those of you unfamiliar with Dawn Warrior, True Sight is a debuff that you apply to enemies that you just simply need to cast, and any enemy hit by it will be debuffed. This is exceptionally important for not only Dawn Warrior's personal damage, but also their ability to help out their team. It is also the one and only thing I hate about the Dawn Warrior class. I hate manual debuffs, but you can't exactly like everything about a class, so I just kind of deal with it. However, the burst sequence offers a solution. The beautiful thing about the buff sequence is that no matter how many abilities you cram on one single sequence button, it is pretty much faster than casting any of those individual abilities by themselves. So you can pretty much add True Sight to literally everything you buff sequence. You just want an Angelic Buster macro that just casts Angelic Buster Link, True Sight, and then maybe you throw on a decent skill on there. Well, you're done. Now you got something that activates your AB Link and debuffs the enemy. And then I just made a buff sequence, which I do on all of my characters, things that has like all my decent skills on it, Echo of Hero, and then True Sight's in there, and that is my new True Sight button. That way I'm always casting Hero's Echo, I'm always casting my buffs, and it's really convenient. But if you would like an even better example of this benefiting you, let's go over to Buccaneer. The example I just gave you of combining True Sight, Angelic Buster Link, and a decent skill is a good example of putting the minimal stuff on there just to get the casting delay. But that does come with a downside. The problem with the buff sequence is it shows the cooldown of the longest thing on cooldown, which if you fill it with a decent skill is likely always going to be the decent skill. In the case of an AB Link True Sight decent macro, you will never be able to really tell the cooldown of your Angelic Buster Link, but you can solve that problem by just putting Angelic Buster Link on some other button on your hotbar, which thankfully we actually have room to do thanks to the burst button. However, in the case of Buccaneer, they do have something to benefit from this. Pirate Banner is able to be put on the burst button, which is something that surprised me. And Buccaneer is one of the very few classes left in this game that have two castable buffs that don't have any cooldown. Buccaneer is able to use this wonderfully, because not only can you just make a simple Angelic Buster buff sequence that casts Angelic Buster Link a little bit more reliably and faster, and still see the cooldown properly without the need of putting it somewhere else on your bar, but you can also do the same thing with Pirate Banner, a move that has atrocious casting delay, even though you can animation cancel it with Corkscrew Blow. This benefit gives you the full animation cancel. It's not only faster than Corkscrew Blow, but with this method you don't need to reposition yourself by forcibly using Corkscrew Blow Corkscrew Blow to cancel the animation delay on Pirate Banner. This way you can see the cooldown beautifully, and it's all on one simple button, and the animation is so insanely fast. And to show you just how much faster it is when you cast one of these buffs through the buff sequence, here is some footage of my Dawn Warrior using True Sight both with the buff sequence and without. I am holding a direction to walk the entire time in this footage, that way whenever the casting delay is done, my character will immediately start walking again. You can see just how little delay there is when you have the buff sequence, even when it's loaded up with a bunch of stuff, which really just emphasizes how significant it is on an ability that has substantial casting delay such as Pirate Banner. And I gotta imagine there are a lot of different classes in the game that have some kind of skill that can be put on the buff sequence that benefits in the exact same way as this. And since everyone in the game has access to every decent skill and some form of Hero's Echo, there is always something you can put on the bar to fulfill the 3 skill requirement to actually have a castable buff sequence. I also just think it's a really good idea to have an actual buff sequence filled with all your buffs, like your decent skills, maybe you're an archer and you have real sharp eyes, on your bar somewhere. If you're like me, you do a lot of Arcariums and Gulliks on your various characters to get minor progress on your account, and I don't always feel like transferring my pets for those things. And normally, before the buff sequence, I just did it without buffs. Not really a big deal, but the extra crit rate, crit damage, all that stuff does help, especially the drop rate with Holy Symbol. Having an actual button with all my buffs on it, I find to be an incredibly convenient thing. People might also just miss one of your pet's auto buffs for a party buff, and well, maybe you need to manually recast it, or you just need to refresh Hero's Echo, and why not refresh everything else? It's a button that I'll just press every once in a while, and I'm also the kind of person to frequently forget my pets when I start a boss mule. So having a button like this just prepared and ready for times like that, or any other reason you would need it, I find to be worth it. Plus you have 10 buttons. You certainly have the room. But it is not all sunshine and rainbows. Not everything from every class can be added to the buff sequence, and for some classes that was kind of a deal breaker for me. I was really looking forward to this solving some of my more severe problems with classes like Ice Lightning Mage and Cannon Master, classes that have some kind of annoying buffs to cast, some that require to be on the ground, and unfortunately the buff sequence does not bypass any ground requirements. If something needs to be casted on the ground, it still needs to be even if you're in the buff sequence. Though for annoying as that may sound, again with a very minimal casting delay, it's not a big deal to just press the button again. However, if you're a class with like Weapon Aura for example that has 2 charges, sometimes repressing the button might mean activating a second charge needlessly. Granted, in this case it is something that might be solved by the changes coming to Weapon Aura in the 2-minute burst patch. And speaking of that patch, 2-minute classes and Ring of Restraint. Currently, if you want to macro Ring of Restraint into your buff sequence as any sane person would, on a 2-minute class that can mean some awkward situations for specific bosses. Bosses such as Varusilla and Gloom can have awkward windows in which you don't want to burst even though your burst is currently off of cooldown, and that can just lead to some synchronization problems where if you have Ring of Restraint in your burst sequence, you might end up not having it when your origin comes off cooldown, which again is just kinda awkward. Certainly not the end of the world, but there are a couple solutions you can do to solve this problem for now until we get those changes. You can either have 2 different burst buttons, one with Ring of Restraint and one without. I choose that option because I just put the one with Ring of Restraint where my Ring of Restraint button used to be, or you can simply try to put it on its own key with Angelic Buster Link. Sometimes certain classes activate Angelic Buster Link and Ring of Restraint a little further in their burst anyway, and this might just end up working a little bit better. But for me, I like to keep things as compact as possible, and hey, we have this buff sequence that can cast a lot of things at once, and I would like it to cast as many things at once as possible, which really leads me to hoping that some of the classes that can't exactly put many of their burst skills on it eventually get those things included, because I honestly don't quite know why some of them are excluded. Some of them make some sense, some of them don't really make much sense. Cannon Master has a lot of things that are omitted from the burst button, that's a little bit disappointing. Explorer Archers can put their birds on buff sequences, yet a Shadower can't put their Dark Flare, even though they're both summons that do damage. Sure, one has a cooldown and one is ground based, but Pirate Banner can be put on the buff sequence, and it's also a ground-based summon, albeit it doesn't do damage. I got a feeling one day they will open that up a little bit, and perhaps maybe it already was improved in one of the future patches that we are destined to get. A lot of the times with these features, I do read the patch notes for them, but since we don't have the features that they were improving upon, it's kind of hard to understand and really take in some of the benefits that are coming to it. But what about you guys? How did it benefit the classes that you main or play? Did it surprise you in some ways? Maybe disappointed you by some things that weren't castable?